Wellington had everything a man could want at 42 years old. He sat at the head of Wellington Industries, a tech empire worth billions with offices spanning 3 continents. His penthouse overlooked the glittering Manhattan skyline. His garage housed cars most people only saw in magazines, and his calendar filled with meetings that shaped markets and moved millions. Yet on this particular Thursday evening, as he adjusted his watch and straightened his Tom Ford suit, something felt different. The boardroom on the 73rd floor buzzed with anticipation. 20 executives sat around the massive glass table, their faces illuminated by the glow of laptops and tablets. Tonight's meeting would determine the fate of a merger that could add another $2 billion to the company's valuation. Strode into the room with the confidence of a man who had never known failure. His presence commanded attention. At 6'3" with salt and pepper hair perfectly styled, he embodied success. Every person in that room had fought to be there, had climbed corporate ladders and sacrificed personal lives for a chance to sit at this table. Took his seat at the head, nodding to his assistant Jennifer, who immediately began distributing leather-bound folders containing the evening's agenda. The Japanese investors on the video screen bowed slightly and returned the gesture with practiced ease. This deal had been 18 months in the making, and tonight they would finally sign. As the presentations began, servers in crisp white uniforms entered quietly through the side doors. The Wellington Tower spared no expense for these crucial meetings. Crystal decanters filled with premium whiskey sat on silver trays, alongside bottles of rare wine and champagne. Small plates of gourmet appetizers circulated the room. Noticed the servers but paid them little attention. They were background players in his world, present but invisible, there to serve and then disappear. His focus remained on the financial projections dancing across the screen, the charts showing growth trajectories that would make shareholders very happy indeed. Among the servers moved a woman who seemed almost to blend into the shadows. Her name was Grace, and she had worked in the Wellington Tower for 3 years. At 58 years old, she moved with quiet efficiency, her dark skin contrasting with the crisp white uniform she wore. Grace was the kind of person people looked through rather than at. She refilled water glasses, cleared empty plates, and ensured every executive had what they needed without ever being asked. Her presence was so subtle that most people in the building could not have described her face even though they saw her daily. She was simply there, part of the machinery that kept the corporate world running smoothly. But Grace was far more observant than anyone knew. She watched people with the keen eye of someone who had spent a lifetime reading situations and sensing trouble before it arrived. She noticed small details that others missed, the tremor in a hand reaching for a glass, the forced smile that did not quite reach the eyes, the tension in shoulders that spoke of stress or danger. Tonight, as she moved around the boardroom, something troubled her deeply. She had seen 3 men in dark suits enter the building an hour earlier. They had not signed in at security. They had not worn visitor badges. They had moved with purpose toward the service elevators, and something about them set off alarm bells in Grace's mind. Was on his 3rd glass of whiskey, his voice animated as he explained the synergies that would result from the merger. His executives laughed at his jokes, nodded at his insights, and competed to add supporting comments that would catch his attention. The Japanese investors seemed pleased. The lawyers were reviewing final contract language. Everything was proceeding exactly as planned. Reached for the decanter to pour himself another drink, already imagining the celebration that would follow the signing. His phone buzzed with congratulatory messages from board members watching the proceedings via secure video feed. Grace approached the table carrying a fresh tray of glasses. Her heart pounded in her chest. She had made a decision that could cost her everything. In her 3 years at Wellington Tower, she had never spoken directly to Wellington. She knew the rules. Service staff remained invisible and silent unless directly addressed. They certainly never interrupted important meetings. They never presumed to give advice to executives, let alone to the CEO himself. But Grace had not survived 58 years by ignoring her instincts, and every fiber of her being screamed that something was terribly wrong tonight. As she reached chair, her hands trembled slightly. She set down a fresh glass, then did something she had never done before. From her pocket, she pulled a small folded napkin. On it, she had written in careful block letters a simple message. She placed it directly on top of the folder in front of her hand, briefly touching the expensive leather. The action took perhaps 2 seconds, but to Grace, it felt like an eternity. Several executives glanced up, mildly surprised to see a server place something on the CEO's materials. Himself did not immediately notice, engaged as he was in a discussion about market share projections with his chief financial officer. Grace stepped back quickly, returning to her position along the wall. Her pulse raced. She had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. If she was wrong, if her instincts had led her astray this time, she would likely be terminated before the night was over. She thought of her grandson who depended on the health insurance this job provided for his asthma medication. She thought of the rent payment due in 2 weeks. She thought of how hard it had been to find this position after years of struggling in various service jobs. Yet despite all these fears, she knew she had done the right thing. Whatever consequences came, she could live with them if it meant potentially saving lives. Finished his point about market projections and reached for his folder to reference a specific data point. His hand touched the napkin Grace had placed there. He frowned slightly, puzzled by this unexpected addition to his carefully organized materials. He picked it up, assuming it was a note from Jennifer about some urgent message or scheduling conflict. As his eyes focused on the handwritten words, his expression changed. The confident smile faded. His brow furrowed. The message was simple and direct, written in neat capital letters that seemed to burn into his consciousness. "Don't drink, leave now." Read it twice, 3 times. His first instinct was irritation. Who dared interrupt this crucial meeting with such a cryptic and presumptuous message? He looked up, scanning the room for whoever had left this bizarre note. His eyes passed over Jennifer, who looked back at him with questioning concern, clearly not the author. He glanced at his executives, but all were focused on the presentation now being delivered by the head of international operations. Then his gaze found Grace, still standing against the wall with her tray, her dark eyes meeting his with an intensity that startled him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the room, saw something in Grace's expression that gave him pause. It was not the deferential blankness he was accustomed to seeing in service staff. Instead, her eyes communicated urgency, fear, and absolute certainty. She gave the smallest nod toward the napkin in his hand, then glanced meaningfully toward the door. Every instinct had developed in building his empire told him this woman believed she was trying to save his life. But from what? The merger documents, a poisoned drink, corporate sabotage, it seemed absurd. Looked down at his glass of whiskey, still half full, the amber liquid catching the light beautifully. Don't drink. The message was specific. He thought about the decanters that had been brought in specially for this meeting. He considered the dozens of people who had access to this room throughout the day. He remembered reading about corporate espionage, about poisonings and attacks that seemed like things from thriller novels until they happened in real life. His rational mind fought against the paranoia, insisting this was all ridiculous, that he was the CEO of a major corporation surrounded by security systems and loyal employees, but had not built his empire by ignoring his instincts. He had learned long ago that sometimes the most important information came from unexpected sources. He thought about all the times a janitor's observation or a receptionist's comment had provided crucial insight into problems brewing beneath the surface of his organization. The people who moved invisibly through corporate spaces often saw things that executives, caught up in their own importance, completely missed. He looked at Grace again. She had not moved, but her expression remained urgent. This was not a prank. This was not some confused elderly woman making a scene. This woman genuinely believed he was in danger. Made his decision in seconds. He stood abruptly, cutting off the presentation mid-sentence. 20 faces turned toward him with expressions ranging from confusion to concern. "Ladies," he said, his voice carrying the authority that made people instantly pay attention, "I apologize, but we need to pause this meeting immediately. Something urgent has come to my attention that requires my immediate presence elsewhere." The room erupted in murmurs. The Japanese investors on the screen looked bewildered. His chief operating officer started to stand, asking if everything was all right. Jennifer reached for her phone, assuming some family emergency had occurred. "Everyone needs to leave this room now," continued, his tone brooking no argument. "Do not take anything with you. Leave your materials, your drinks, everything on the table. Exit through the main doors and proceed to the conference room on the 72nd floor. Security will direct you." The murmurs grew louder, confusion turning to alarm. As head of security, a former Secret Service agent named Thomas, who always attended these high-level meetings, was already on his feet, speaking rapidly into his radio. Thomas knew well enough to recognize that the CEO would not disrupt a billion-dollar merger without serious cause. Within 2 minutes, the boardroom was emptying. Executives filed out, casting confused glances back at the abandoned table with its expensive bottles and half-finished drinks. The Japanese investors had been assured via video that the meeting would resume shortly, and apologies were profuse. Jennifer ushered the last stragglers toward the elevators, her phone pressed to her ear as she tried to manage the chaos of rescheduling and explaining without knowing what exactly she was explaining. Remained in the room with only Thomas and 2 other security personnel. And Grace, still standing against the wall, her tray clutched tightly in her hands. Walked directly to her. Up close, he could see the fear in her eyes, but also the determination. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice gentler than it had been when commanding the room. Grace swallowed hard. "Grace, sir, I work in building services. I've been here 3 years." Her voice was steady despite her obvious nervousness. Held up the napkin. "Why did you give me this? What made you think I was in danger?" Grace glanced at Thomas and the security guards, suddenly aware that her words would have consequences. But she had come this far. There was no turning back now. "I saw 3 men earlier," she began, her words coming faster as she committed fully to her story. "They came in through the loading dock around 6 o'clock. They weren't dressed like delivery people or maintenance. They wore suits, but wrong suits, too formal for this building, and they moved wrong. I've worked service jobs all my life, sir. You learn to read people. You learn to spot trouble. These men, they didn't sign in. They went straight for the service elevator. I watched them get off on this floor." Thomas was already on his radio issuing commands, listened intently as Grace continued. "I followed them, staying back where they wouldn't notice me. People never notice the cleaning staff. They went into the kitchen area where the catering is prepared for executive meetings. I watched through the door window. One of them pulled something from his pocket, a small bottle or vial, and he put something into the whiskey decanter. The expensive one with the crystal stopper that only gets used for your biggest meetings." The room seemed to freeze. Felt ice water run down his spine. He looked at the decanter sitting on the table, the same one he had poured from 3 times tonight. The same one he had been reaching for again when Grace placed her note. Thomas was already moving toward the table, pulling on latex gloves he produced from his pocket, carefully lifting the decanter without drinking from it. "They saw me," Grace continued quietly. "Or one of them did. He looked right at me, and I pretended I was just cleaning, checking supplies. I smiled like I was too stupid to understand what I'd seen. But then they left quickly, and I just knew I had to warn you. I didn't know how else to do it without causing a scene that might alert whoever they were working with. So I wrote the note." Stared at this woman who had risked everything to save his life. He thought about how close he had come to pouring that 4th glass, about how he would have toasted the successful merger and drunk deeply, celebrating a victory that would have been his last. He thought about the executives and investors who had also drunk from that decanter tonight. "Did anyone else drink from this specific bottle?" he asked urgently. Thomas was already checking the table, examining which glasses had been poured from which containers. "Sir, it looks like this decanter was set at your position specifically. The others have different bottles." The realization hit like a physical blow. This had not been random poisoning or corporate terrorism. This had been assassination. Someone wanted him dead specifically, and they had planned it carefully, knowing his preference for fine whiskey during important meetings, knowing which bottle would be placed directly within his reach. He had been targeted, and if not for a woman whose name he had not known an hour ago, he would likely already be dying. The security team was expanding rapidly. More guards flooded into the room. The building was being locked down. Police were being called. Teams were being summoned to handle the potentially poisoned whiskey safely. Grace stood silently, watching the organized chaos unfold around her. She had done what she needed to do. Now she just hoped she would not lose her job in the aftermath. She had depending on her. She had bills to pay. She had already been thinking about how she would explain to her daughter that she had been fired for overstepping her bounds, but had not forgotten her. Even as he spoke with security chiefs and police commanders, even as he made calls to board members and attorneys, he kept glancing back at her. Finally, after what felt like hours but was perhaps only 20 minutes, he walked back to where she stood. "Ms.," he said formally, and Grace straightened her posture. "You saved my life tonight. You saw something suspicious, you trusted your instincts, and you took action even though it could have cost you your job. That takes remarkable courage." Grace did not know what to say. She had not been expecting thanks. She had been expecting termination paperwork. "I don't know how to repay that kind of courage," continued, his voice thick with emotion he rarely allowed himself to show. "But I'm going to start by making sure you never have to worry about your job security again, and by ensuring your family has everything they need." The investigation that followed would dominate headlines for weeks. The poisoned whiskey contained enough toxin to kill within hours. The three men Grace had seen were identified through security footage and arrested within days. They were hired killers working for a corporate rival who had hoped to derail the merger by eliminating and throwing Wellington Industries into chaos. The plot was sophisticated, planned over months, and would have succeeded if not for the observant eyes of a woman whom most people never bothered to see. Grace became briefly famous, her face appearing in news stories as the hero who saved a billionaire CEO. But the attention made her uncomfortable. She preferred her quiet life, her invisibility, her routine. What changed was not Grace's nature but her circumstances. Wellington kept his promise. He promoted her to head of Building Security Services, a position created specifically to utilize her observational skills and instincts. Her salary increased 20-fold. Her grandson received the best medical care available. Her daughter, who had been struggling as a single mother, found opportunities suddenly opening up, doors that had been closed now swinging wide. But more than the material changes, something shifted in how viewed the world around him. He began to notice people he had previously looked through. He learned the names of the security guards, the cleaning staff, the kitchen workers. He discovered that these invisible people had insights about his company that his highly paid executives lacked. They knew which managers treated their teams poorly. They knew which departments had morale problems. They knew where inefficiencies hid and where problems festered. The people at the bottom saw things those at the top missed, and realized he had been blind in his success, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants while ignoring the honest perspectives of people who had nothing to gain by flattering him. The merger eventually went through, delayed by only 2 weeks while the investigation concluded. The Japanese investors were impressed by how handled the crisis, by his calm leadership and decisive action. But himself was changed. Every time he walked into his boardroom now, he thought about that Thursday night. He thought about how close death had come, how easily his empire could have crumbled, how his children could have been planning his funeral instead of their futures. He thought about Grace and her simple note written on a napkin, 5 words that had saved his life. "Don't drink, leave now." Sometimes the most important messages come from the most unexpected messengers. Sometimes the people we overlook are the ones who see us most clearly. Sometimes courage wears a service uniform and speaks in a quiet voice. Learned these lessons the hard way, but he learned them well. And he made sure that everyone in his organization learned them too. No one at Wellington Industries would ever again make the mistake of thinking that position determined worth or that visibility equaled importance. The people who kept the lights on, who cleaned the offices, who served the meals, they were not invisible anymore. They were essential, valued, and heard. Grace still worked at Wellington Tower, but now she had an office with her name on the door. She still moved through the building with quiet observation, still noticed things others missed, but now when she spoke, people listened. She had proven that instinct and courage matter more than titles or degrees. She had shown that heroism sometimes looks like an older woman in a white uniform taking a risk to do what was right. And Wellington never forgot that his life, his fortune, and his future had been saved not by expensive security systems or highly trained bodyguards, but by a black maid who cared enough to write a warning on a napkin. That was a debt he could never fully repay, but he would spend the rest of his life trying. Leaned closer to his computer screen, his heart rate accelerating as he watched the black sedan park in his driveway. Through the kitchen window camera, he could see Maria's face transform from the warm, maternal expression she had been wearing while helping Emma with homework to something that looked like fear mixed with resignation. She quickly instructed both children to go upstairs to their rooms, speaking in a tone that was firm but not harsh. Emma obeyed immediately, apparently accustomed to this routine that had never witnessed before. Two men emerged from the sedan, both wearing expensive suits that couldn't quite conceal the muscular builds underneath. The taller one had graying hair and moved with the confident swagger of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. His companion was younger, maybe mid-30s, with cold eyes that scanned the neighborhood as if checking for witnesses. Neither man looked like they belonged in the upscale residential area, and their presence immediately set off alarm bells in his mind. Maria opened the front door before the men could ring the bell, suggesting she had been expecting their visit. The audio feed picked up fragments of their conversation in Spanish, spoken too quickly and quietly for to understand despite the 2 years of college Spanish he had taken decades ago. But the tone was unmistakable. The older man was clearly in charge, speaking to Maria with an authority that made her shoulders tense and her hands tremble slightly. The younger man remained silent, standing slightly behind his companion like a bodyguard ready to enforce whatever demands were being made. Grabbed his phone and quickly downloaded a translation app, his fingers fumbling with the controls as he tried to capture and translate the rapid Spanish conversation. The words that came through made his stomach clench with growing dread. References to money, schedules, and what sounded like threats about consequences for failure. The older man mentioned numbers that could have been amounts or dates, while Maria responded with what appeared to be explanations or excuses that only seemed to anger him further. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, but it felt like hours as watched his children's caretaker interact with these threatening strangers in his own home. When the men finally left, Maria stood in the doorway for several long moments, her hands pressed against her face in a gesture of despair that was heartbreaking to witness. She looked like a woman trapped in a situation far beyond her control, bearing burdens that no nanny should ever have to carry while caring for someone else's children. After the sedan disappeared down the street, Maria called the children back downstairs, immediately resuming her cheerful demeanor as if nothing unusual had happened. She helped them finish their homework, prepared their dinner, and supervised their evening routines with the same patient attention she always provided, but could see the tension in her movements now, the way she kept glancing toward the windows and checking her phone with nervous frequency. Whatever those men had wanted, their visit had left her deeply shaken. That night barely slept as his mind raced through possible explanations for what he had witnessed. The most logical assumption was that Maria was involved in some kind of criminal activity, possibly drug trafficking or money laundering that used his home as a cover. The men could be her suppliers or handlers, checking on operations and making threats to ensure her cooperation. But this theory didn't match with the Maria he had observed for 3 years, who had never shown any signs of wealth beyond her modest salary, and had always been punctual, reliable, and genuinely caring toward his children. Another possibility was that Maria was being victimized rather than participating willingly. Immigration issues, family members in danger, or debts that required regular payments could all explain why she might be forced to cooperate with criminals. This scenario felt more consistent with her character and would explain the fear he had seen in her face during the men's visit. But it also raised terrifying questions about what kind of danger his children might be in as unwitting witnesses to whatever illegal activities were taking place in their home. Spent the next day in a state of distracted anxiety, barely able to focus on the important merger negotiations that had consumed weeks of preparation. Every few minutes, he found himself checking the camera feeds on his phone, watching Maria go through her normal routines with the children while his mind conjured increasingly dark scenarios about what might be happening beneath the surface. The innocent activities he observed, reading stories and helping with art projects, now seemed like elaborate performances designed to maintain a false sense of normalcy. The breakthrough came on Wednesday afternoon when decided to review the previous night's footage more carefully. The cameras continued recording after the children went to bed, capturing several hours of Maria's evening routine that he had never seen before. She spent time cleaning the kitchen and preparing for the next day, just as he would have expected. But at approximately 11:30, she received a phone call that changed everything about her behavior. The caller spoke English with a heavy accent that the audio system captured clearly enough for to understand. The voice belonged to an older woman who addressed Maria as, and spoke with the urgent tone of someone delivering bad news. Listened in growing horror as the conversation revealed a web of criminal exploitation that had been operating under his roof for months without his knowledge. Maria's sister was being held by a human trafficking organization in Miami. The same group that had smuggled both sisters into the United States 3 years earlier was now demanding additional payments that far exceeded what either woman could afford on legitimate wages. The men who had visited S's house were collectors for this organization, ensuring that Maria understood the consequences of failing to meet their financial demands. Her sister's safety depended on regular payments that Maria could only manage by supplementing her nanny's salary with illegal activities. The phone conversation revealed that Maria had been forced to allow the house to be used as a temporary storage location for packages that she was told contained documents, but which she suspected contained something far more dangerous. These packages would be delivered when was at work, and the children were at school, hidden in various locations around the property, then collected by different associates later the same day. Maria never handled the contents directly and tried to ensure the children never witnessed these activities, but she lived in constant terror that they might accidentally discover something that would put them in danger. Felt physically sick as he listened to Maria crying softly into the phone, begging the woman on the other end for more time to find alternative solutions. She spoke about looking for a second job, borrowing money from friends, or even returning to Colombia if it would guarantee her sister's safety. But the woman's responses made it clear that Maria was trapped in a situation with no easy escape. The trafficking organization had invested too much in establishing their operation in home to simply walk away, and they had no intention of releasing until significantly larger sums were paid. The conversation ended with Maria promising to continue cooperating while desperately trying to negotiate for her sister's release. After hanging up, she sat alone in the kitchen for over an hour, her head buried in her hands as silent tears fell onto the marble countertop that had personally selected during the home's renovation. The image of this brave woman crying alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the luxury he had worked so hard to provide while carrying such a terrible burden in secret, would haunt him for the rest of his life. Thursday brought a new level of surveillance as found himself checking the camera feeds obsessively throughout the day. He watched Maria maintain her professional composure with the children, helping Emma practice for her upcoming piano recital, and encouraging interest in building increasingly complex robot designs. But now he could see the subtle signs of strain that he had missed before. The way she checked her phone anxiously whenever the children were occupied, the forced brightness in her smile when she thought they weren't looking, and the careful way she positioned herself to watch both entrances to whatever room they were in. At 2:15 in the afternoon, witnessed the criminal operation in action for the first time. A delivery truck arrived while the children were at their after-school tutoring sessions, and the driver handed Maria a small package that she accepted with obvious reluctance. The driver spoke briefly with her in Spanish, apparently providing instructions about timing and location. Maria waited until he left, then walked through the house with the package, finally hiding it behind some books in the library where kept his collection of rare first editions. The package remained hidden for less than 3 hours before a different visitor arrived to collect it. This time, the collector was a woman who looked like she could have been Maria's aunt, dressed modestly and driving a small, unremarkable car that wouldn't attract attention in their neighborhood. The exchange took place quickly and quietly, with minimal conversation, and no sign that either woman enjoyed this criminal transaction. Both seemed eager to complete their business and return to their normal lives as soon as possible. Realized that he was witnessing a sophisticated operation that used his home's respectability and location to facilitate illegal activities while maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. The packages were small enough to be hidden easily and transferred quickly. The timing was carefully coordinated to avoid detection, and the people involved all looked like ordinary citizens rather than stereotypical criminals. If he hadn't installed the cameras specifically to monitor these areas, he never would have discovered what was happening under his roof. That evening made one of the most difficult decisions of his professional life. Instead of confronting Maria directly or calling the police immediately, he chose to investigate further to understand the full scope of the situation before taking any action that might endanger his children or make things worse for Maria. He used his company's resources to research human trafficking organizations operating along the East Coast, discovering a complex network of criminal enterprises that specialized in exploiting vulnerable immigrants through debt bondage and family hostage situations. The information he uncovered painted a picture of an industry that generated billions of dollars annually by preying on people's desperation to build better lives in America. Families were separated deliberately, with some members held in virtual slavery, while others were forced to work in legitimate jobs to pay impossible debts. The traffickers were experts at identifying households likes, where wealthy employers hired domestic workers without conducting thorough background investigations that might reveal the workers' desperate circumstances. Also learned that victims of these organizations were often afraid to seek help from law enforcement, because they had been told that cooperation with police would result in immediate deportation and increased violence against their family members. Many victims had witnessed or heard about brutal retaliation against people who tried to escape or report their traffickers, creating a culture of silence that allowed these criminal enterprises to operate with minimal interference from authorities. Friday morning brought a new level of urgency when observed Maria receiving another phone call that left her visibly shaken. This conversation was brief and conducted entirely in rapid Spanish that his translation app couldn't process quickly enough to provide real-time understanding. But Maria's physical reaction told him everything he needed to know. She sank into a chair as if her legs could no longer support her weight, one hand pressed against her mouth to stifle what looked like a sob of despair. After ending the call, Maria sat motionless for several minutes before slowly gathering her composure and preparing to greet the children when they returned from school. Watched her transform from a woman receiving devastating news into the cheerful, attentive caregiver his children had grown to love and depend upon. The strength and selflessness required for such a performance filled him with admiration and guilt in equal measure. That afternoon, as he watched Emma and work on their weekend homework assignments while Maria provided patient guidance and encouragement, made a decision that would change all of their lives forever. He was going to find a way to help Maria save her sister and escape from the criminal organization that had trapped them both. But first, he needed to gather more information about exactly who they were dealing with, and what resources would be required to successfully challenge such a dangerous enemy. The safety of his children had to be the top priority. Spent the weekend conducting the most important research of his life, using his company's advanced databases and private investigation contacts to learn everything possible about the criminal organization that had infiltrated his home. What he discovered was far more complex and dangerous than he had initially imagined. The trafficking network operated across multiple states, with sophisticated money laundering operations, political connections, and a reputation for brutal retaliation against anyone who threatened their business interests. The organization was run by a man named, who had built his empire over 15 years by targeting vulnerable immigrant communities and establishing operations in wealthy suburbs where his activities could hide behind the respectability of legitimate households. His network included dozens of domestic workers placed in homes throughout New England, all of whom were forced to participate in criminal activities to secure the safety of family members held in various locations. The operation generated millions of dollars annually through drug trafficking, money laundering, and human smuggling, with law enforcement agencies struggling to build cases against such a distributed and well-protected enterprise. Learned that Maria Santos wasn't even her real name. Her actual identity was Maria, and she had entered the United States illegally 3 years earlier with her younger sister after fleeing violence in Colombia. The sisters had paid their life savings to smugglers who promised safe passage and legitimate employment opportunities, only to discover that their debt to the organization would require years of forced labor to repay. Had been sent to work in agricultural operations in Florida, while Maria had been placed in domestic positions where her education and gentle manner made her an ideal caregiver for wealthy families. The background check that had received before hearing Maria had been completely fabricated, created by associates within the organization who specialized in producing false documentation and references. Her credentials from early childhood education programs were real, earned during her previous life in Colombia, where she had worked as a teacher before the violence that destroyed her community and forced her to flee. But everything about her immigration status, work history, and personal references had been carefully constructed to pass superficial screening processes used by domestic employment agencies. Also discovered that his house wasn't the only property being used for illegal storage and transfer operations. The organization had identified at least 12 other households in the Boston area where domestic workers were being forced to facilitate criminal activities. The homes were chosen specifically for their locations in low-crime neighborhoods where police presence was minimal and wealthy residents were unlikely to question unusual deliveries or visitors. The criminal network had studied the routines of busy executives like understanding that their frequent travel and long work hours created perfect opportunities for criminal operations to flourish undetected. Sunday evening brought a new urgency to the situation when observed another visit from the two men in the black sedan. This time, their conversation with Maria was longer and more heated, with the older man clearly making demands that she was struggling to meet. The younger man remained silent, but moved closer to Maria in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate her. Watched helplessly as these criminals threatened the woman who had been caring for his children, using his own home as the setting for their extortion. The conversation revealed that Maria was behind on her required payments, and that the organization was losing patience with her excuses. They demanded that she increase her cooperation by allowing larger packages to be stored for longer periods, essentially turning his house into a more significant distribution center for their criminal enterprise. Maria tried to explain that this would increase the risk of discovery and endanger the children, but the men dismissed her concerns with threatening gestures and harsh words that made her visibly flinch. After the men left, watched Maria check on Emma, and who had been playing video games upstairs during the threatening visit. She hugged both children a little longer than usual, as if trying to memorize the feeling of holding them safely in her arms. The tender moment broke his heart as he realized how much genuine love Maria had developed for his children, despite the terrible circumstances that had brought her into their lives. She wasn't just their caregiver. She had become their surrogate mother during his extended absences, providing emotional support and stability that his demanding career had prevented him from offering. Monday morning marked the beginning of his most challenging week as both a father and a businessman. He had to maintain his normal professional schedule while secretly planning a rescue operation that would require careful coordination, significant financial resources, and potentially dangerous confrontations with violent criminals. His first step was contacting David, a former FBI agent who now ran a private security company that specialized in corporate espionage and executive protection services. David had provided security consulting for his company during a hostile takeover attempt 2 years earlier, and his background in federal law enforcement gave him insights into criminal organizations that would be invaluable for planning any intervention. When explained the situation during a confidential meeting at David's downtown office, the security expert's expression grew increasingly grave as he recognized the signs of a sophisticated trafficking operation that had been operating under law enforcement's radar. David confirmed research about and his organization, adding details from federal databases that painted an even darker picture of the criminal enterprise. The FBI had been investigating for years, but had struggled to build prosecutable cases because his victims were afraid to testify, and his operations were carefully designed to avoid leaving evidence that could be traced back to leadership. Several previous attempts to rescue trafficking victims had resulted in violence and retaliation that had made other potential witnesses even more reluctant to cooperate with authorities. The security expert explained that any rescue attempt would need to be coordinated carefully to ensure the safety of both Maria and her sister, who was being held at a facility in Miami that served as both a workplace and a prison for trafficking victims. The organization monitored their victims constantly through various methods, including regular check-ins, GPS tracking devices, and surveillance of their family members in other locations. A simple attempt to extract Maria from her situation could result in immediate harm to her sister and potentially create danger for children if the criminals decided to retaliate. David recommended a multi-phase approach that would require several weeks to implement properly. The first phase would involve gathering additional intelligence about the organization's operations, including the location where was being held and the schedules of key personnel involved in the criminal network. This information would be crucial for planning a coordinated rescue that could free both sisters simultaneously while minimizing the risk of retaliation. The second phase would involve working with federal authorities to ensure that law enforcement agencies were prepared to take action against the broader criminal organization once the rescue operation began. While David began his investigation, faced the daily challenge of watching his children interact with Maria while knowing the terrible secret she was hiding from them. Emma had been working on a special art project for Maria's birthday next month, creating a handmade card with pictures of their family activities and messages about how much she loved her caregiver. Had been teaching Maria to play chess, patiently explaining strategies, and celebrating her victories with genuine enthusiasm. The children's obvious affection for Maria made realize how important she had become to their emotional well-being during the difficult years following their mother's death. Tuesday brought a new development that accelerated its timeline for action. While reviewing the overnight camera footage, he discovered that Maria had received another package delivery, but this one was significantly larger than previous transfers and had been hidden in the basement storage room rather than the more accessible locations used for quick exchanges. The package remained hidden for the entire day, suggesting that it contained something too valuable or dangerous to be moved quickly through the normal distribution channels. That evening witnessed Maria making a phone call that was clearly a desperate plea for help. She spoke in English this time, apparently trying to reach someone who might be able to provide alternative solutions to her impossible situation. The conversation was with someone named Roberto, who appeared to be a family friend or distant relative living somewhere in California. Maria begged Roberto to loan her money that could be used to negotiate release, explaining that the trafficking organization was demanding increasingly dangerous cooperation that could endanger innocent children. Roberto's responses, which could hear faintly through the audio feed, made it clear that he was sympathetic but unable to provide the kind of assistance Maria needed. The amounts being demanded were far beyond what any ordinary person could afford, and Roberto also expressed fear about becoming involved with dangerous criminals who might retaliate against anyone who interfered with their operations. The conversation ended with Maria thanking Roberto for listening, but accepting that she would have to continue cooperating with her traffickers until she could find another solution. Wednesday evening brought the most terrifying moment of surveillance when he observed Emma accidentally discovering the package hidden in the basement. His 9-year-old daughter had been looking for art supplies in the storage room when she noticed the suspicious package tucked behind some holiday decorations. With typical childhood curiosity, Emma had begun examining the package when Maria discovered her and quickly redirected her attention to other activities. But the incident had clearly shaken Maria, who spent the rest of the evening anxiously checking her phone and glancing toward the basement. Realized that his children were no longer just innocent bystanders in this criminal operation. They were now potential witnesses who could accidentally expose activities that violent criminals were desperate to keep secret. The organization's patience with Maria was already wearing thin, and any additional complications could result in desperate actions that might put Emma in direct danger. The time for careful planning and gradual intervention was rapidly running out. Thursday morning made the decision that would change everything. Instead of waiting for David's investigation to produce a complete intelligence picture, he chose to take immediate action to protect his children and rescue Maria from her impossible situation. The plan he developed was risky and would require precise timing, but it offered the best chance of saving both sisters while ensuring his children's safety. He would need to move quickly before the criminal organization realized that their operation had been discovered, and before any additional packages or visits put his family in even greater danger. Spent Thursday coordinating the most complex operation of his life, utilizing resources from his technology company, David's security firm, and contacts within federal law enforcement agencies who specialized in trafficking cases. The plan would require simultaneous actions in Boston and Miami, careful management of evidence to ensure successful prosecutions, and emergency arrangements to protect everyone involved from potential retaliation. By Thursday evening, all the pieces were in place for a rescue operation that would either save two innocent women and bring down a criminal organization, or put everyone cared about in mortal danger. That night, as he watched Maria help Emma, and with their bedtime routines through the camera feeds, felt the weight of responsibility for their safety settling on his shoulders. The woman who had unknowingly brought danger into his home was the same person who had provided his children with love, stability, and care during the most difficult period of their young lives. Tomorrow would determine whether his intervention would save her, or Friday morning arrived with deceptive normalcy as watched Maria prepare breakfast for Emma and through the kitchen camera feed. She moved through her familiar routines with practiced efficiency, helping Emma find her library books for school and listening patiently as explained his latest robot design, but could see the tension in her shoulders and the way she kept glancing at the basement door where the mysterious package still remained hidden. Today would be the day everything changed, though Maria had no idea that her secret ordeal was about to end. David had worked through the night with his team to finalize the rescue operation that would unfold simultaneously in Boston and Miami. Federal agents from the Human Trafficking Task Force had been briefed on the situation and were standing by to coordinate arrests of organization members once the rescue began. The operation required split-second timing, because any delay could allow the criminals to harm or retaliate against family. At exactly 10:15 in the morning, while Emma and were safely at school and Maria was alone in the house, the coordinated intervention would begin. had spent the early morning hours moving his children to his sister, Jennifer's house in Connecticut under the pretense of a surprise long weekend visit. Jennifer had been confused by the sudden request, but had agreed to take Emma, and without asking too many questions about's urgent business emergency. Getting his children safely away from the house was the most crucial element of the entire plan, because it eliminated any possibility that they could be used as leverage by desperate criminals who might try to escape prosecution through hostage situations. At 9:30, called Maria from his office to inform her that he would be working late again and wouldn't be home until Sunday evening. This conversation, which was being recorded by David's team, established apparent absence from the house and gave Maria no reason to suspect that anything unusual was about to happen. She responded with her typical professional courtesy, assuring him that she would take good care of everything and asking if he needed her to prepare anything special for his return. The normalcy of their interaction made his heart ache as he realized how much he had grown to respect this brave woman who had sacrificed so much to protect her sister. In Miami, federal agents had been conducting surveillance on the agricultural facility, where was being held along with dozens of other trafficking victims. The compound was disguised as a legitimate farming operation, but intelligence gathering had revealed that workers were locked in dormitory buildings at night, had their identification documents confiscated, and were threatened with violence if they attempted to leave or contact outside authorities. Had been identified through photographs provided by Maria, and agents had confirmed that she was being held in Building C, which housed women who were considered flight risks due to family members who might attempt rescue operations. At exactly 10:15, David and two of his associates arrived at his house in an unmarked van equipped with sophisticated surveillance equipment. Their cover story, if questioned by neighbors, was that they were technicians upgrading the home security system for a client who traveled frequently on business. Maria answered the door promptly, clearly recognizing that these weren't the usual visitors associated with the criminal organization, but uncertain about their actual purpose or intentions. David identified himself and explained that he was working with to address a situation that had been discovered through security footage. He spoke calmly and professionally, emphasizing that Maria was not in trouble and that they wanted to help her escape from the dangerous situation she had been forced into. Maria's initial reaction was panic and denial, insisting that she didn't know what he was talking about and asking him to leave immediately. But when David mentioned his name and the facility in Miami where she was being held, Maria's composure crumbled, and she began crying with a mixture of relief and terror. The next hour involved careful negotiation as David's team worked to convince Maria that the rescue operation was real, and that both she and her sister would be protected from retaliation. Maria had lived in fear for so long that she struggled to believe that escape was possible, repeatedly expressing concern that any attempt to help would result in death and potential harm to Emma and David patiently explained the federal resources involved in the operation and the simultaneous raids that were being conducted to arrest key members of the trafficking organization. making it impossible for them to carry out threatened retaliation. While David's team worked with Maria in Boston, federal agents in Miami were executing their own phase of the rescue operation. At exactly 10:30, coordinated raids began at 3 locations associated with trafficking network, including the agricultural facility where was being held. The raids were timed to prevent communication between locations that might alert criminals about the law enforcement action and give them opportunities to harm victims or destroy evidence. The rescue at the Miami facility encountered significant resistance as armed guards attempted to prevent federal agents from accessing the dormitory buildings where victims were being held. 2 guards were arrested after a brief confrontation, but their resistance delayed the rescue by crucial minutes that allowed some supervisory personnel to escape through previously prepared exit routes. However, the agents successfully secured the facility and began the process of identifying and interviewing the 43 victims they found, locked in conditions that could only be described as modern slavery. Was found in Building C, exactly where intelligence reports had indicated she would be located. She was malnourished and showed signs of physical abuse, but she was alive and coherent enough to provide immediate information about the organization's operations that would prove invaluable for ongoing investigations. When agents told her that her sister Maria was being rescued simultaneously in Boston, broke down crying with relief and disbelief that their nightmare might finally be ending. She had been told repeatedly that any attempt to escape or seek help would result in Maria's death, and she had endured terrible conditions to protect her sister from harm. Back in Boston, Maria was struggling with the decision to trust David's team and provide information that could help federal investigators build cases against her traffickers. She had been conditioned to believe that cooperation with authorities would result in immediate deportation and guaranteed retaliation against, making it difficult for her to accept that rescue was actually possible. David showed her real-time updates from the Miami operation, including photographs confirming that was safe and in federal custody, before Maria finally agreed to cooperate fully with the investigation. The package hidden in its basement proved to be even more significant than investigators had expected. When federal agents carefully examined the contents, they discovered sophisticated computer equipment that was being used to coordinate money laundering operations across the trafficking network. The equipment contained encrypted files with financial records, communication logs, and operational details that provided federal prosecutors with evidence linking dozens of individuals to the criminal organization. This house had unknowingly served as a critical hub for the network's financial operations, making Maria's cooperation even more valuable for dismantling the entire enterprise. Maria's detailed debriefing provided federal agents with information about 12 other households in the Boston area, where domestic workers were being forced to participate in criminal activities. This intelligence enabled law enforcement to conduct simultaneous raids at these locations, rescuing 17 additional trafficking victims and arresting 11 associates of the organization. The coordinated operation represented the largest single action against human trafficking networks in New England's history, and provided prosecutors with evidence to pursue federal charges carrying life sentences for key organizational leaders. Himself was arrested at his estate in Coral Gables while attempting to flee to Colombia with several $1 million in cash and false identification documents. His arrest came after a high-speed chase that ended when federal agents surrounded his vehicle at a private airfield, where a chartered jet was waiting to transport him to safety. The arrest was particularly satisfying for investigators who had been tracking for over 5 years, while he had successfully evaded prosecution through intimidation of witnesses and corruption of local officials. By Friday evening, the immediate crisis was over, but faced the challenge of helping Maria transition from being a trafficking victim to becoming a key witness in federal prosecutions that could take years to complete. The Justice Department's Victim Protection Program would provide temporary housing, legal assistance, and immigration support. But Maria's future remained uncertain as prosecutors prepared for complex trials against a criminal organization that had generated hundreds of millions of dollars through the exploitation of vulnerable immigrants. Returned to his house that evening to find it transformed from a crime scene into evidence of law enforcement's most successful operation against human trafficking in recent memory. Federal agents had carefully documented everything, collected electronic evidence, and prepared detailed reports that would support prosecutions of over 40 individuals connected to the network. But the house felt empty and strange without the sounds of children playing and Maria's gentle voice, providing comfort and guidance during evening routines. The emotional reunion between and his children at Jennifer's house was both joyful and complicated, as he tried to explain why they couldn't return home immediately and why Maria wouldn't be there when they did. Emma had grown to love Maria deeply, and the news that she had been forced to participate in criminal activities by people threatening her sister was difficult for young minds to process. Found himself struggling to explain concepts like human trafficking and extortion in terms that wouldn't traumatize children who had already lost their mother to senseless violence. Saturday brought the first of many difficult conversations as David and federal prosecutors worked to develop a comprehensive plan for protecting Maria, and while ensuring their cooperation with ongoing investigations. Both sisters would need extensive medical care, psychological counseling, and legal support as they recovered from years of exploitation and began building new lives in freedom. The process would require patience, resources, and careful coordination between multiple government agencies that weren't accustomed to working together on such complex cases. Realized that his role in this situation was far from over. Maria had risked her life to protect his children during her forced cooperation with criminals, and he felt a moral obligation to ensure that both sisters received the support they needed to recover from their traumatic experiences. His financial resources could provide opportunities for education, medical care, and legal assistance that government programs might not fully address. But more importantly, his children needed him to help them understand how someone they loved could have been trapped in such a terrible situation through no fault of her own. The investigation also revealed troubling information about how many other wealthy households might be unknowingly harboring trafficking victims among their domestic staff. Federal agents estimated that hundreds of domestic workers throughout New England were being exploited by criminal organizations that used legitimate employment as cover for illegal activities. This discovery prompted to question his own hearing practices and consider how other busy executives might be more carefully screening potential employees to avoid inadvertently supporting criminal enterprises. Sunday evening brought Maria back to his house for the first time since her rescue, accompanied by federal agents who needed her to walk through the locations where criminal activities had taken place. The reunion with Emma was emotional and complicated, as the children struggled to understand why their beloved caregiver looked so tired and sad despite being safe from the bad people who had been threatening her sister. Maria tried to maintain her composure while explaining that she might not be able to continue working as their nanny, but that she would always love them and treasure the memories of their time together. As watched this painful goodbye unfold in his living room, he realized that the camera system he had installed to spy on his children's caregiver had ultimately saved the life of a woman who had shown them more love and stability than he had been able to provide during the most demanding years of building his business empire. The technology designed to catch a criminal had instead revealed a victim who needed rescue, transforming his understanding of justice, family, and the responsibilities that came with his privileged position in society. The final resolution of their shared crisis would take months to unfold through federal courts and immigration proceedings. But that Sunday evening marked the end of Maria's forced participation in criminal 6 months after the dramatic rescue operation that dismantled trafficking network. Stood in the federal courthouse in downtown Boston, watching Maria raise her right hand to take the oath as a naturalized American citizen. The transformation in her appearance since that terrible Friday when federal agents had liberated her from forced criminality was remarkable. The constant fear that had shadowed her features for years had been replaced by a quiet confidence and genuine smile that reflected her newfound freedom and security. Stood beside her sister during the naturalization ceremony, having recovered significantly from the physical and psychological trauma of her imprisonment in Miami. The sisters had spent months in counseling and medical treatment, supported by victim assistance programs and private funding for specialized care that government resources couldn't fully provide. Had enrolled in community college to pursue nursing education, while Maria had decided to complete her interrupted teaching credentials through an accelerated program designed for immigrant professionals seeking to rebuild their careers. The federal prosecutions had proceeded more successfully than anyone had dared to hope, had been sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms without parole for human trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering charges. His conviction was largely based on evidence recovered from his basement and testimony from Maria, and dozens of other victims who found the courage to speak against their former captors. 47 members of the trafficking organization received sentences ranging from 15 years to life, effectively dismantling a criminal enterprise that had generated over $200 million through the exploitation of vulnerable immigrants. Children had struggled initially with understanding the complex situation that had brought danger into their home, while simultaneously providing them with the loving care they had desperately needed after losing their mother. Emma had required months of age-appropriate counseling to process their feelings about Maria's forced participation in criminal activities and their own unwitting proximity to dangerous situations. But gradually, they had come to understand that Maria's love for them had been genuine even while she was trapped in an impossible situation that required terrible choices to protect her sister. The relationship between and Maria had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful than a typical employer-employee arrangement. Had established a generous scholarship fund in Maria's name to support other trafficking survivors pursuing education, and he had hired Maria as a full-time educational consultant for his company's corporate social responsibility programs. Her lived experience with exploitation and recovery provided invaluable insights for developing workplace policies that could identify and assist vulnerable employees who might be facing similar situations. David's security firm had expanded its services to include human trafficking awareness training for wealthy households and corporate clients, using lessons learned from the investigation to help other employers recognize warning signs of criminal exploitation among domestic workers. The training programs emphasized the importance of conducting thorough background checks through legitimate channels and maintaining appropriate oversight of household activities without invading workers' privacy or creating atmospheres of suspicion and mistrust. The house in Beacon Hill had been renovated extensively to remove any physical reminders of its use as a criminal storage facility, but had chosen to keep the security camera system as a tool for ensuring his family's ongoing safety. The cameras were now openly disclosed to all household staff, with clear policies about privacy protection and appropriate use of surveillance technology. Had also implemented regular security briefings with local law enforcement to maintain awareness of potential threats, while building relationships that could facilitate rapid response to any future concerns. Emma's art project for Maria's birthday had been completed the previous month, featuring drawings of their family activities and heartfelt messages about love, forgiveness, and the importance of helping people who are in trouble. The project had become a centerpiece of Maria's new apartment, which she shared with in a safe neighborhood where both sisters could rebuild their lives without fear of retaliation or discovery by criminal associates seeking revenge for their cooperation with federal investigators. Had surprised many of his business associates by scaling back his demanding work schedule to spend more time with his children and participate actively in community organizations focused on supporting immigrant families and trafficking survivors. His technology company had developed new software applications that helped law enforcement agencies track and investigate human trafficking networks, donating both technology and expertise to federal task forces working to combat modern slavery throughout the United States. The experience had fundamentally changed perspective on wealth, responsibility, and the hidden suffering that could exist within apparently prosperous communities. He had learned that his privileged position carried obligations beyond financial success and comfortable living, including vigilance about how his lifestyle choices might inadvertently support or enable the exploitation of vulnerable people. This awareness had influenced his approach to hearing, business partnerships, and community involvement in ways that extended far beyond his immediate family's circumstances. Had developed a particular interest in justice and law enforcement as a result of witnessing the investigation that had freed Maria and from their traffickers. His chess games with Maria now included discussions about strategy, patience, and the importance of thinking carefully before making important decisions that could affect other people's safety, and these conversations had helped both the child and the adult process their shared experience, while building a new relationship based on mutual respect and genuine affection, rather than the artificial constraints of their previous employer-employee dynamic. The broader impact of the investigation had extended throughout New England and beyond, as federal agencies used intelligence gathered during the operation to identify and dismantle related trafficking networks in other regions. Over 300 victims had been rescued during follow-up investigations, and new protocols had been established for screening domestic workers and identifying households that might be harboring trafficking victims. The case had become a model for coordinating law enforcement responses to sophisticated criminal organizations that used legitimate businesses and households as cover for illegal activities. Maria's testimony before congressional committees investigating human trafficking had helped shape new legislation providing enhanced protections for victims and increased penalties for traffickers who exploited immigrant communities. Her articulate descriptions of the fear, isolation, and impossible choices faced by trafficking victims had moved senators and representatives to approve funding increases for victim assistance programs and specialized law enforcement units. The legislation, known informally as the Maria Act, had been signed into law by the president in a White House ceremony that and his children attended as honored guests. Had emerged as an effective advocate for trafficking survivors, speaking at conferences and training sessions where her insights helped healthcare professionals, social workers, and law enforcement officers better understand the complex trauma experienced by victims of modern slavery. Her nursing education had been accelerated through specialized programs designed to help trafficking survivors enter healthcare professions, where their personal experiences could benefit other victims seeking medical care and psychological support. The anniversary of the rescue operation had been marked by a private celebration at its renovated home, where Maria and joined Emma, and for a dinner that celebrated their shared journey from crisis to recovery. The evening had included the presentation of a special award from the FBI recognizing Maria's courage in cooperating with federal investigators despite enormous personal risk. But more importantly, it had provided an opportunity for all of them to reflect on how their lives had been changed by events that had initially seemed threatening, but had ultimately brought them closer together as an unconventional family. Sister Jennifer had become an active supporter of Maria and's transition to independence, providing friendship and practical assistance as they navigated the challenges of building new lives in freedom. Jennifer's own children had developed close relationships with both sisters, creating an extended family network that provided emotional support and stability for everyone involved. These relationships had helped realize the importance of community connections in healing from trauma and building resilience for future challenges. The security consultation business that David had developed as a result of the investigation had become highly sought after by wealthy families, corporations, and government agencies, seeking to protect themselves from infiltration by criminal organizations. David's expertise in identifying and investigating human trafficking operations had led to consulting contracts with international organizations working to combat modern slavery in developing countries where criminal networks often originated before expanding into wealthy nations like the United States. Emma and had both shown remarkable resilience in processing their experience, with discovering that someone they loved had been trapped in a dangerous situation beyond her control. Their understanding of justice, compassion, and the complexity of adult problems had matured significantly as a result of age-appropriate counseling and careful conversations about how good people sometimes found themselves in terrible circumstances through no fault of their own. These lessons had influenced their approach to friendships, academics, and community service in ways that made proud of their developing character and empathy. The scholarship fund established in Maria's name had already supported the education of 15 trafficking survivors pursuing degrees in fields ranging from social work to business administration. The program provided not only financial assistance, but also mentorship opportunities and internship placements that helped survivors develop professional skills and confidence. Several scholarship recipients had gone on to establish their own organizations focused on supporting immigrant communities and preventing exploitation of vulnerable workers. As watched Maria and embrace their new American citizenship certificates outside the federal courthouse, surrounded by friends, advocates, and fellow survivors who had built a supportive community around their shared experiences. He reflected on how much his understanding of family, security, and responsibility had evolved since that terrifying day when he had first discovered criminals operating within his own home. The camera system he had installed to spy on his children's caregiver had ultimately revealed not a threat to be eliminated, but a victim to be saved, and a teacher who would change his entire approach to living a meaningful life. The investigation that had begun with suspicion and fear had concluded with justice, healing, and the creation of lasting relationships that enriched all of their lives, had learned that true security came not from surveillance and isolation, but from building genuine connections with others and accepting responsibility for protecting the vulnerable members of his community. The millionaire who had once hidden behind his wealth and demanding career had discovered that his greatest assets were the courage to act when others were in danger, and the wisdom to recognize that helping others ultimately helped himself build the kind of family and legacy that would honor Sarah's memory while securing Emma's future in ways that money alone could never accomplish, and the beginning of a new chapter for everyone whose lives had been changed by discovery of the truth hidden within his own. Homeroy, the fragile family they had all built together in the aftermath of tragedy and loss. The final phase of discovery was about to begin, and nothing would ever be the same for any of them. But he couldn't stand by and watch a good woman suffer when he had the power and resources to make a difference.